Paul and Linda Barker were married for 47 years, raised a child together, and shared a quiet life in a small Pennsylvania town. But after Paul's death, Linda discovered that the man she loved had been hiding their son's body beneath their home the entire time. In the summer of 1983, the Barker family lived a peaceful life in the small town of Millersfield, Pennsylvania. The kind of town where everyone knew each other, where front doors stayed unlocked, and where children played until the streetlights came on. Paul Barker, 37 at the time, worked as a senior accountant at a local firm. He was quiet, methodical, and well-respected in the community. His wife, Linda, was a second-grade teacher at the elementary school, known for her warm smile and the way she remembered every student's birthday. Together, they were seen as the ideal couple, stable, hardworking, and deeply in love. They had one child, a 9-year-old boy named Daniel, who was the center of their world. Daniel was the kind of child who left a lasting impression. He had a mop of sandy blonde hair, bright green eyes, and a boundless curiosity about the world. He loved dinosaurs, was obsessed with space, and carried a dog-eared book of constellations everywhere he went. He was the kind of boy who asked a million questions before breakfast and who insisted on saying goodnight to each of his stuffed animals. To Paul and Linda, he was more than a son. He was a miracle. They had struggled for years to conceive, and when Daniel finally came along, he became the light of their lives. On June 17, 1983, a hot Friday afternoon, Daniel asked his parents if he could ride his bike to Greenridge Park, just 4 blocks from their house. It was a routine he'd done many times before. The park was small, with 2 swings, a sandbox, and a crooked metal slide. Linda gave him a gentle reminder to be home by 5. Paul nodded from behind the newspaper. Daniel grabbed his over the years following Daniel's disappearance. Life inside the Barker household slowly changed, though from the outside, it appeared much the same. The missing posters eventually came down. The volunteers stopped knocking. The police calls grew less frequent, and the media, once eager for updates, moved on to newer stories. But for Paul and Linda Barker, time didn't heal anything. It simply learned how to cover up the wound. Linda clung to hope with a quiet but relentless determination. She became involved in local efforts to support families with missing children. She kept Daniel's room exactly the same, dusting his shelves, folding his clothes, and even replacing the batteries in the small planetarium night light he used to keep by his bed. She went to every support group she could find, handed out flyers at state fairs, and mailed letters to news stations asking for help keeping Daniel's case alive. Each year, on his birthday, she baked a cake and placed it at the dinner table. With a candle, Paul sat beside her, often in silence, and held her hand while she made a wish she never spoke aloud. Paul's grief looked different. Quieter, less visible. After the initial shock, he returned to work quickly, immersing himself in long hours and endless spreadsheets. He never resisted Linda's efforts to keep Daniel's memory alive, but he rarely participated either. He rarely cried. He didn't talk much about the past. When Linda brought up their son, Paul would offer a nod or a comforting word, then shift the topic to something practical: car repairs, groceries, retirement savings. He built a model train set in the basement and spent hours alone with it, building miniature towns, painting tiny people, and making the trains run on time. It became his world, predictable, quiet, controllable. Friends and neighbors admired the way the Barkers stayed together. Many couples didn't survive that kind of loss, but Paul and Linda did. They attended church on Sundays, sent holiday cards, and hosted quiet New Year's Eve dinners. Their love seemed to have endured something unthinkable. People called them strong, resilient, a symbol of commitment through tragedy. No one knew the silence that filled their home most nights, or the way Linda would sometimes find Paul sitting in the dark basement, unmoving, staring at nothing. In 1990, 7 years after Daniel vanished, the case was officially declared inactive. Linda protested, writing letters to the local sheriff, state officials, and even the governor. But nothing changed. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence pointing to foul play or to a runaway. Just a missing boy and the same unanswered questions. One day he was there. The next, he wasn't. Despite the weight of it all, Linda and Paul grew old together. They took quiet vacations to lakeside cabins, spent holidays with cousins and nieces, and watched neighbors' children grow into adults. Linda eventually retired from teaching and started a small nonprofit dedicated to missing children. She gave talks at community centers and raised funds for search technology and child ID kits. Paul supported her, but always from the background. He built the brochures on the computer and balanced the books. He never stood in front of a crowd or gave a speech. When asked, he'd say, "Linda is better with people." In time, the sharp edges of grief dulled into something heavier but easier to carry. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner, their 30th with a short cruise, their 40th with a gathering of close friends and family. At every celebration, a candle was lit for Daniel, and a photo of him as a smiling 9-year-old sat on the mantel. Through it all, Paul remained steady, calm, dependable. He built new shelving in the kitchen, refinished the deck, replaced the old water heater. Every few years, he would repaint Daniel's room, keeping it just as it had been, neat, untouched, frozen in time. That be why the time Paul reached his late 70s, his health began to decline. Nothing dramatic at first, just the normal wear of age. He moved slower, took more naps, forgot small things. Linda, still sharp and organized, handled his medications and made sure he got to his appointments. Their life had become quiet and predictable, a daily routine of coffee, crossword puzzles, evening TV shows, and early bedtimes that to the world. They were a couple who had endured the unendurable, who had stayed together when most would have fallen apart. What no one could have known, not even Linda herself, was that everything she believed about their shared pain, their grief, and their love had been built on a foundation of lies. Paul Barker passed away quietly on a Wednesday morning in April of 2024. He had been asleep in his recliner, a blanket pulled up to his chest, and a cup of cold tea on the side table. Linda found him when she came down to open the windows, as she did every morning. There was no struggle, no sign of pain, just stillness. The doctor later confirmed it had been a heart attack. Peaceful, sudden. After nearly 5 decades of marriage, Linda was alone for the first time in her adult life. The days that followed were a blur of condolences, floral arrangements, casseroles, and paperwork. The funeral was modest, just as Paul had wanted. Friends, former colleagues, and distant relatives gathered to remember a kind, loyal, and hard-working man. No one had a bad word to say about him. Linda sat in the front row, holding Daniel's photograph in her lap, quietly mourning the two greatest losses of her life. After the service, Linda returned to the empty house with a heavy heart. It was strange how quiet everything felt. She wandered from room to room, touching things Paul had used just days before. His glasses, folded neatly beside the remote. A half-finished crossword. His favorite slippers. As the weeks passed, she began the slow process of sorting through his belongings. Drawers, closets, boxes in the garage. Some items made her cry. Others made her smile. Each object carried a memory, a piece of the life they had built together. Eventually, she turned her attention to the attic. It was a space Paul had claimed for himself, a cluttered area filled with tools, cables, and old electronics. Linda rarely went up there. The pull-down ladder creaked as she climbed, bringing with her a flashlight and a cardboard box for donations. Dust hung in the air, and the temperature was stifling. She moved carefully through the tight space, scanning for anything worth keeping or giving away. Near the far wall, tucked behind some insulation and stacks of old newspapers, she noticed a large plastic bin labeled Electric Projects. It wasn't unusual. Paul had always been fascinated with electronics. He had a habit of fixing things other people would have thrown away. Radios, clocks, even an old VCR he kept running long after DVDs had taken over. She pried the lid off the bin, expecting to find more of the same. Inside were wires, soldering tools, and a few disassembled gadgets. But beneath those, she discovered something unexpected, a heavy metal container, about the size of a small shoebox. It was locked with a combination latch. Linda stared at it, her heart beginning to race. The container looked out of place among the clutter. It was pristine, unlike the dusty surroundings, and sealed so tightly that it seemed to beg for secrecy. She tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. There was no label, no indication of what it might contain. Curiosity quickly gave way to unease. She brought the box down from the attic and placed it on the kitchen table. After several failed attempts at guessing the combination, She called a local locksmith. The locksmith arrived the next morning. It took him nearly an hour, but the lock eventually gave way with a sharp click. Linda opened the lid with trembling hands. Inside, she found a child's sock, old, faded, and clearly worn. A plastic toy car. A few Polaroid photographs showing Daniel, taken on what appeared to be the day he vanished, wearing the same shirt and jeans he had on when he left for the park. The background of the photos was unfamiliar, and in one of them, Daniel appeared to be crying. At the bottom of the box was a small glass vial with a dried reddish substance inside. Next to it, a notebook filled with handwritten notes and symbols. She couldn't decipher. The writing was neat, orderly, but cold and clinical. Dates, times, and what looked like codes. Lastly, there was an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed tightly, and addressed in Paul's handwriting. Only if you find this. Linda didn't open it. Not right away. Instead, she stared at the contents, trying to breathe, trying to think. Everything in that box felt wrong, like it didn't belong in her home. A cold dread settled into her bones. She called the police without hesitation. Something deep inside her had shifted. What she once believed about her life, her husband, and the tragedy they had endured together was beginning to unravel, and she didn't know if she was ready for the answers that were coming. The investigation that followed the discovery of the box was swift and intense. Detectives from the cold case unit arrived at Linda's home within hours of her call, bringing evidence technicians and forensic experts. The items in the metal container were carefully cataloged, sealed, and transported for analysis. Linda watched from her porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as men in gloves and masks moved in and out of the house she had lived in for most of her life. She felt as though her world had been knocked loose from reality. The husband she had loved for 47 years had kept something hidden, something dark, and she had never seen it coming. Within days, the Polaroids were authenticated as original prints from the 1980s. The clothing in the photos matched what Daniel had been wearing the day he disappeared. Facial recognition software confirmed it was him. Experts determined the images had likely been taken indoors, under artificial light. The sock, faded but intact, also matched items from Daniel's wardrobe. It still had a sticker with his name inside the fabric. But it was the vial that shifted the case from disturbing to criminal. The reddish substance inside was confirmed through DNA testing to be blood. More specifically, Daniel's blood. It was an undeniable match, made possible by preserved medical records and Linda's own DNA. The authorities now had evidence that Daniel had bled after his disappearance and that Paul Barker had not only known something about it, he had preserved proof. This revelation was enough to reopen the cold case. As an active homicide investigation, detectives began reviewing every detail from the original file, interviewing anyone who had been involved with the case in 1983. They dug through Paul's history, looking for any past allegations, behavioral flags, or psychological issues. They found nothing. Paul Barker had never been arrested, never showed signs of violence, and was regarded by his peers as a stable, even dull, man. But his quiet life had been carefully curated, and investigators were now convinced it had been a mask. The most critical break came when a detective stumbled across a receipt from 1998 among Paul's old tax records. It showed the purchase of heavy-duty concrete mix, rebar, and rental equipment used for breaking up flooring. There had been no renovations done to the house that year, according to building permits. The receipt raised a troubling question. What had Paul used that concrete for? Search warrants were issued immediately. Investigators returned to the Barker home with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. They focused on the basement, particularly an area Paul had walled off decades earlier, claiming it was for water damage control. Linda said she had never questioned it. It had just become part of the house's structure, something she walked past every day without thinking. To her, it had simply been storage space she never used. The dogs alerted on the sealed crawl space. When the floor was broken open, they found a narrow concrete slab beneath the dirt. After hours of digging, the truth emerged. Encased in the concrete, in a fetal position, were the skeletal remains of a young boy. Forensic teams worked carefully, documenting every inch. Dental records confirmed what Linda had feared since the moment she saw that metal box. It was Daniel. Her son had never left the neighborhood. He had never run away. He had never been kidnapped by a stranger. He had been buried beneath their own home. The discovery shook the small town of Millersfield. News outlets descended upon the quiet neighborhood. Reporters camped outside the Barker residence, eager to piece together the unimaginable story. How could a father live in the same house with his child's body hidden beneath the floor? How could a man hug his wife for decades, comfort her through sleepless nights, and let her weep into his arms over a tragedy he had caused? Authorities scoured Paul's belongings for any indication of motive. The notebook found in the box offered fragments, dates, diagrams, possibly plans, but nothing that clearly explained why. Psychologists were brought in to offer insight. Some suggested Paul may have suffered from undiagnosed psychopathy or dissociative tendencies. Others speculated it was a fit of rage or a dark compulsion he managed to suppress for the rest of his life. But none of the theories brought comfort. There was no note of remorse, no confession beyond the vague message on the envelope. Only if you find this. Whatever Paul had done, he had taken the reasons with him to the grave. For Linda, the pain was more than she could bear. The man she had trusted most, who had held her hand through a lifetime of sorrow, had been the very source of it. The floor she had walked across thousands of times had covered the worst secret imaginable. She had mourned beside a murderer, and the truth had been lying beneath her feet all along. After the discovery of Daniel's remains and the confirmation that Paul Barker had buried their son beneath their own home, Linda found herself trapped in a life she no longer recognized. Her days became quiet and disjointed, filled with small, strange moments of disbelief. She would reach for her coffee mug and wonder how many times Paul had done the same after hiding what he had done. She walked through her house, pausing in doorways, looking at ordinary things, a clock, a light switch, a worn patch of carpet, and saw ghosts behind each one. Every familiar corner now felt poisoned by betrayal. Investigators concluded their work in the house within a few weeks, but the damage was permanent. Linda made the decision to leave the home, unable to sleep under the same roof that had unknowingly held her son's body for over 4 decades. She stayed with a cousin out of state for several months while legal procedures played out. There was no trial, no defense, no statement from the accused. Paul was gone, beyond questioning. Still, the state closed the case with an official declaration. Daniel Barker's death was ruled a homicide, with his father, Paul Barker, named as the sole suspect. No one else had been involved. No other arrests were made. What followed was not closure. It was something else, something messier and far more difficult to live with. The community struggled to process the truth. The same man who had once handed out Halloween candy and shoveled neighbors' driveways had been hiding a crime that turned every memory into a lie. People whispered about what might have happened that day in 1983, but there were no answers to be found. Paul had never left. A detailed account. The envelope Linda had found inside the metal box contained only a short message, written in Paul's familiar, steady handwriting. I did what had to be done. I couldn't let him go. That was all. Psychologists and true crime commentators speculated endlessly in the weeks that followed. Some believed Paul may have discovered something about Daniel, something that triggered an overwhelming response. Others thought Paul had always harbored dark tendencies, but had mastered the art of appearing normal. A few experts suggested he had acted out of some twisted belief that he was protecting his family, although from what, no one could say. There were even those who believed Paul might have been suffering from a long-term psychological disorder that had gone unnoticed. But every theory felt incomplete, like trying to explain a nightmare using only daylight logic. Linda didn't participate in the media coverage. She declined interviews, turned away journalists, and refused offers from documentary filmmakers. For her, this was not a story to be told. It was a life that had been broken in ways no one else could fully understand. She requested that the house be demolished, and it was. Where it once stood, there is now an empty lot with grass struggling to grow. Linda never visited the site again. In time, she returned to a small apartment near her sister's home in upstate New York. Her days were simple, quiet, and often heavy. She found a therapist, not because she believed it would fix anything, but because she needed to speak her pain aloud to someone who wouldn't recoil. She told the story over and over, trying to peel it apart, trying to understand how she had lived beside a man who was capable of something so monstrous. There was no abuse, no signs of cruelty, no red flags in their marriage. Paul had been patient, calm, even affectionate. Whatever darkness he carried, he had buried it alongside their child that teen night. Linda sometimes replayed the early days after Daniel went missing, the searches, the vigils, the tears. Paul had held her every night, whispering reassurances, promising they would find their son. He had pressed flyers into her hand, walked beside her through parks and forests. He had cried with her. And all that time, he had already known the truth. It was not just Daniel's death that haunted her. It was the decades of deceit layered gently into their every interaction that in her old age, Linda stopped using words like husband or father when she spoke of Paul. She called him the man I married. She kept a single framed photo of Daniel beside her bed, the one taken on his 8th birthday, a year before everything ended. She often sat and stared at it, not with tears, but with the numb ache of someone whose world had shifted beneath her feet. She had been married for 47 years. She had shared a bed, a table, a life. But she had no idea, not the slightest clue, of what the man she loved had done. And now, all she had left was the truth and the terrible silence that came with it.